Hello everyone and welcome to Middle-earth and Fantasy Lore. Today we're going to talk about a fun subject and who was the greatest warrior slash fighter in all of Middle-earth history. So basically who was the Chuck Norris, Vin Diesel, Mr. T of Middle-earth. Now a couple of rules we're going to set for this. Valar don't count because they're gods, so if they did count, Tulkas would easily be number one, the championship fighter of the Valar. No one could beat him. Then you would also have to count Eonwë, the Herald of Manwë, who pulled Morgoth out of Utumo the first time. But we're not going to count those because Valar and Maiar are basically gods and demigods. Well, they're gods and angels more or less. So they're not on the same level as humans and mortals. This isn't Dragon Ball Z where, a mortal can equal the level of a god. So I would say that Valar and Maiar are not actually in the counting. I'm also not going to count Huan the Warhound because he's like a god dog, so kind of the same thing. So basically it's elves, dwarves, and men. Who were the greatest fighters? I'm going to do top 5 in all of Middle-earth. Now, the top 5 are all warriors in the First Age, so those of you who've only watched The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings will not recognize these names. However, I am going to go over a couple of honorable mentions on who I think the greatest fighters were of both the Second and Third Ages. Of the Third Age, this is one guy that everyone's very familiar with. I believe the best fighter in the Third Age was actually Elrond. If you watch The Hobbit, and the part where him, Gandalf, Saruman, and Galadriel are actually in Dol Guldur fighting the Necromancer, you can see the awesome swords play that Elrond has. And he also has high knowledge of elven magic and lore, and spells that he can produce, like with the horses in the river at Rivendell. So Elrond, I believe, despite the combat prowess of Legolas and Aragorn, and Gimli, of course, I think Elrond can easily outmatch them in one-on-one combat due to his magic prowess and his fighting prowess. So, because, at that battle at Dol Guldur, when they're all fighting against Sauron, the Necromancer, Galadriel, yes, she did use the magic to combat Sauron, but she didn't fight all his minions. Elrond had the magic and the fighting prowess. Gandalf and Saruman don't really count because they're Maiar, and they're kind of like angels, so they don't count. So I would have to say the best warrior in the Third Age of Middle-earth is Elrond. What about the Second Age? The Second Age is actually very hard to decide because it was a dark age, and there were many probably Numenorians who were great fighters. I don't really know of any off the top of my head by name as the best fighter, but the ones I do know are probably Gil-galad and Elendil. Basically the heads of the last alliance of elves and men. And they led the army and fought Sauron one-on-one. Now they lost because they died, and Isildur was the one who eventually took the ring from Sauron, but from the movie it looks like he just got a lucky swipe. Because there was no way a guy, like a young lad like that could actually defeat Sauron. So I think Sauron just got careless and he got a lucky swipe. But Elendil and Gil-galad both fought Sauron, but they lost. But even so, I think they are probably some of the best warriors in the Second Age. Now, let's move on to the top 5. There are many, many great warriors in the First Age, and if you want to know more about it, you should read the Silmarillion or the Lost Tales, and you'll know what I'm talking about. But I have them ranked from number 5 to number 1, and I'll explain my reasons for this. There are Melinda Maiar, the Maiar is not counted in this. She's not really a fighter, but she did kind of protect, Thingol's land from pretty much everything. But she's a Maiar, so she doesn't count. And like I said, Onwë doesn't really count. The Herald of Manwë doesn't really count because he's a Maiar also. Tulkas obviously doesn't count. Neither does Orme. So we're going to go with... the list is basically comprised of elves. Although, people like Hurin people like the First Age, the Edain, like Hurin, would rank on a wider list. But I think in terms of fighting and combat prowess, they can't match those of the High Elves. So let's start with the list. At number 5, we have Glorfindel. Now, this is not the Glorfindel that appeared to Aragorn and Frodo when they were arriving towards Rivendell. Besides, the part with Arwen being there, that was just the movie. That actually never happened in the books. It was Glorfindel and not Arwen. He is the head of the House of Goldenhair, And the one we saw in the Third Age is actually a reincarnation of the one in the First Age. Now, the one in the First Age was present at the fall of Gondolin, which was Turgon's kingdom. And what he did was pretty valiant. He actually fought a Balrog one-on-one. Now, he destroyed the Balrog, but he died in the process, so we'll call it a draw. But he was able to go one-on-one with a Balrog, which puts him almost at Gandalf level in the Third Age. So he's definitely one of my top 5. And he outranks people in fighting prowess, people like Finrod Philogon, who defeated a werewolf but died in the process, because I think defeating a Balrog greater than werewolf. So that's my ranking. So number 5 goes to the head of the House of the Golden Hair in Gondolin, Glorfindel. Number 4, I have to give to the son of Finwë, Fëanor. Now, we don't see too much battle prowess from Fëanor, but it is said that when the Noldor, his branch of the Noldor, landed in Middle-earth via the boats of the Telari, who they basically slaughtered to get the boats in the kinslaying, that he basically went straight for Morgoth and Angbound, and he slew everything in his way, laughing as he went. Now, when he got close to Angbound, and he probably killed a few Balrogs and a lot of orcs on the way, all the Balrogs kind of ganged up on him because all his companions basically got slain. And all the Balrogs basically ganged up on him, and a Balrog came up behind him, wrapped him up, and then he was cut down by Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. So it took one of the big sub-bosses of Morgoth to actually take down Fëanor. And he didn't do it by himself. He had to have the help of several other Balrogs to actually finally take down Fëanor. And when Fëanor died, they couldn't bury him because his spirit was so hot that his body just burned in ashes. That just tells you what kind of a badass he actually was. So basically, if you count Morgoth as the big raid boss, then like Gothmog and the Black Dragon, I think his name is Ancalagon the Black, they're like kind of like the big sub-bosses. So it took a sub-raid boss plus lots of powerful minions in the form of Balrogs to actually defeat Fëanor. Now, if you saw The Lord of the Rings and how scary the Balrog actually looked in Khazad-dûm, picture several of these having to gank Fëanor at once, and then their boss having to come up and finally cut him down. That's how powerful Fëanor was. But he's only number 4 on the list, because even though he slew a lot of enemies, in the end he was cut down by Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs. Number 3, I have Ecthelion of the Fountain. He is also another character in Gondolin, and one of the best fighters in all of Middle-earth. He fought and slew several Balrogs when Gondolin fell. He is the Warden of the Fountain, and he slew several Balrogs in combat. And then he faced off against Gothmog, Lord of Balrogs, who was also accompanied by dragons. He fought him in one-on-one combat. Now, both of his arms were hewn off, but with the spike on his helmet, he rammed into Gothmog and both fell and died in the fountain. So after slaying several Balrogs and maybe dealing with the dragons that were accompanying Gothmog, the Lord of Balrog, which is basically like the lieutenant, he was basically Morgoth's lieutenant at that point. I don't think Sauron was quite Morgoth's lieutenant. I think like Gothmog was actually, he's the captain of Angband. So he was basically his fighting lieutenant. Sauron might have been his administrative lieutenant, but Gothmog was his fighting lieutenant. So he basically went even with Gothmog, and they both did like a double KO after he had already taken out several Balrogs. Now that has to rank. Now I put him above Fëanor because he actually killed Gothmog, and Fëanor did not actually kill Gothmog. Even though Fëanor was probably the greatest Noldor in history, and the son of Finwë and the crafter of the jewels, I have to put Ecthelion above Fëanor because he actually killed the guy who killed Fëanor. So Ecthelion of the Fountain comes in at number 3. Now, who might you think is above them? Well, there's 2. At number 2, we have the Father of Elrond in Arendelle. Oh, but some of you may be asking, what the hell did he actually do? He sailed and pleaded for the future of elves and men in Middle-earth to the Valar. I mean, that's a great deed, but I don't know about his combat feats. But you will have to remember that in the 42-year War of Wrath, that Arendelle was their final trump card. Because remember, after they had defeated all of Morgoth legions, Morgoth got desperate and released the winged dragons, and their coming actually pushed the host of the Valar actually back because they were so terrible. And the dragons were led by none other than Ancalacan the Black, which was a giant dragon and the head of Morgoth's winged dragons. Now, no one knew what to do with Ancalacan the Black, but Arendelle came in his boat shining with white flame, and he fought with Ancalacan the entire night. And before the rising of the sun, he actually slew the giant Leviathan, and in its fall, it destroyed Morgoth's towers, Theragadam, his towers, and that was the final defeat of Morgoth. So Ancalacan the Black was the mightiest of Morgoth's dragon host, the most devastating of his army. So Arendelle being able to slay him in combat, one-on-one basically, and not die at the same time, I have to put him above all the others so far. Above Fëanor and above Ecthelion of the Fountain, even though Ecthelion was extremely impressive, because I count Ancalacan the Black as a tougher enemy than Gothmog even. So Arendelle the Mariner, Elrond's father, places number 2 on the greatest warriors ever of Middle-earth. Now, number 1, he actually lost the battle, but he fought the biggest raid boss of them all. He fought the raid boss, Morgoth, and he wounded him 7 times. So number 1 has to go to the High King of the Elves, Fingolfin. And of Finwë's 3 sons, it was said that Fëanor was the best in crafts and lore, which he was because he made the jewels. Fingolfin, however, was the bravest and most valiant, and Finarfin, which stayed back in the land of Amen, was actually the wisest at heart. So Fingolfin, by that, is by default the greatest of the Noldor warriors. But not only because of that, because this guy actually rode to Morgoth's tower and challenged him to one-on-one combat. Okay, not many people do that. And when he was riding in his wrath to Morgoth's tower, none of Morgoth's minions dared get in his way because they thought him riding on his horse, they thought Orme, the hunter goddess, had actually come. So they were too afraid. He basically rode up to the final raid boss's tower and be like, bitch, I challenge you to mortal combat. And Morgoth was actually afraid because he of the Valar alone knew fear. So he challenged Morgoth to mortal combat. Of course, he didn't win because you can't challenge, a mortal man can't really challenge Satan to one-on-one combat and essentially win. And not even Gandalf or Saruman can even come close to it. Sauron doesn't come close to Morgoth in terms of actual power, one being a Maiar and the other being a Valar. Sauron was simply a servant of Morgoth. So he actually fought with Morgoth one-on-one for a long time, wounded him 7 times, but eventually his body gets tired because he's mortal and Morgoth is a god. So eventually he was beaten. But the fact that he actually challenged the big raid boss and forever wounded him 7 times and took a good amount of hit points off of Morgoth in single one-to-one combat, and he has the balls to actually challenge basically what many would say is the mightiest of the Valar to one-on-one combat and actually land several good clean hits on him, makes him number 1 on my list because I believe he could have killed any of Morgoth's servants had they dared try to stop him, including Sauron at that time. Because if mortal beings could slay Gothmog and Ancalacan, I think Fingolfin could have beaten Sauron in one-on-one combat. But he did wound Morgoth several times. He was eventually beaten, but the fact that he challenged the biggest raid boss, and basically the most powerful of the Valar into combat makes him number 1 on my list. So my list goes again. Number 1 would be Fingolfin. Number 2 would be Arendelle. Number 3 is Ecthelion. Number 4 is Fëanor. And number 5 is Glorfindel, all within the First Age. Let me know what you think in the comments and whether you agree with me or not. Thank you and have a nice day.